Allowances. What are they? Why are they important? And how do you do it? I'm Jen, owner of L&M, and welcome to Beginner Sewing Tips. Seam allowance is one of those things that I did not think was super important in the beginning. I did not always follow it. I was like, I don't know what that means. I'm just going to sew a straight line. So your seam allowance is the gap of space between the raw edge of your fabric and where you put your row of stitches, your seam. So in most cases, you're not sewing on the edge of your fabric. You're going to sew, there's going to be a space between the raw edge of your fabric and where your stitch line actually is. That space in between there is what your seam allowance is. The most common seam allowances that you're going to see are 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/8 inch, and 1/8 of an inch if you're doing a top stitch. I feel like those are the most common seam allowances. So why is it important? Not following the seam allowance on a pattern or a tutorial or whatever you're following is going to sometimes pretty drastically change the shape, the size, the fit, the look of the item you're making. Like for example, if you are making a dress, like a dress pattern, and it says use a 1/4 inch seam allowance and you use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, it probably won't fit. Also, another example of why it's important, like when you're quilting, so you're quilting squares together, if your seam allowance isn't exactly the same on all of your squares, they're not going to line up and give you those crispy little corners in all of your quilts. They're going to be a little off. So it's important to know what your seam allowance is and know how to do it. So let's talk about the how. So first thing you're going to do is look at your pattern and see what your seam allowance is. Every sewing pattern or tutorial or whatever should mention a seam allowance. In most of my patterns, I'll use like a 1/4 inch, but just look at your seam allowance. What does it say your seam allowance is supposed to be? So a 1/4 inch on most, I will say most because if you have a teeny tiny presser foot, it's not going to be the same. But on most machines, I find that with an all-purpose presser foot, the edge of the presser foot is about a 1/4 inch. For the rest, you should look at the little plate right under your presser foot on your sewing machine. And on the right side, there should be some little notches or lines or whatever that are labeled on that side. So in order to do your seam allowance to, let's say, 1/2 inch, you're just going to line your raw edge of your fabric up with that line, and then put your presser foot down, put your needle down, and sew and keep your fabric right on that line all the way through. And that's your 1/2 inch seam allowance. I hope this helps. Like I said, I'm at school, but leave some questions or whatever in the comments and I will try to answer them as I can today.